Hello, Poland. It's wonderful to see all of you. Today I'm going to talk to you about three things. Number one, I want to tell you a little bit about what happens in our brains as we become addicted. Number two, I want to talk about why today is an exceptionally challenging time to be in the world, because we're so much more vulnerable to the problem of addiction than ever before. And then I want to talk about what we can do about it. So first, to just define addiction. Addiction is the continued compulsive use of a substance or a behavior despite harm to self and/or others. Addiction is a brain disease, but we still do not have a blood test or a brain scan to diagnose addiction. We base the diagnosis on what we call phenomenology. So these are patterns of behavior that repeat themselves across personalities, cultures, and time periods. Generally, when we're diagnosing addiction, we look for the 3 C's: out of control use, compulsive use, and continued use despite consequences. So what I'd like to do now is to briefly summarize about 75 years of the neuroscience of pleasure and pain. We have in our brains a dedicated reward circuit, broadly speaking, consisting of that large gray matter area right behind our foreheads called the prefrontal cortex. This is like the brakes on the car. Then deep within our midbrain, we have the nucleus accumbens and the ventral tegmental area, rich in dopamine-releasing neurons. Dopamine is our reward neurotransmitter. This is like the accelerator on the car. And addiction is a problem either of too little brakes, too much accelerator, or some combination. One of the most exciting findings in the neuroscience of addiction in the past 75 years is the discovery that pleasure and pain are co-located in the brain and work like opposite sides of a balance. So imagine that deep in your midbrain, there's something like a teeter-totter in a kid's playground. When we experience pleasure, it tips one way, and when we experience pain, it tips the other. But there are certain rules governing this balance, and the first and most important rule is that the balance wants to remain level with the ground, or what neuroscientists call homeostasis. And our brains will work very hard to restore a level balance with any deviation from neutrality. So imagine that we do something that's pleasurable, for example, in my case, eating chocolate or reading romance novels. That releases dopamine in my reward neurotransmitter, and my balance tilts to the side of pleasure. What is happening in the brain? I am releasing dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. And the more dopamine that's released, and the faster that it's released, the more likely is that substance or behavior to be addictive. There have been a series of experiments done in rats, sticking a probe in the brain to measure dopamine firing in response to different stimuli. So we're always releasing dopamine at a kind of baseline tonic level. When we do something that's reinforcing, we increase dopamine firing temporarily above baseline. We know that in rats, chocolate increases dopamine about 55% above baseline, sex is 100%, nicotine 150%, cocaine 225, and amphetamine 1,000. And indeed, if you put a rat in a cage with a lever to press for cocaine or amphetamine, that rat will press that lever till exhaustion or death. This also explains why we like to first have dinner, then have sex, then have a cigarette. But what this slide doesn't capture is the important concept of drug of choice, which is to say we're all wired a little bit differently. And what releases a lot of dopamine in your brain may not release a lot of dopamine in my brain. Also, we don't yet have the capacity to give a rat a little smartphone to measure the amount of dopamine released in response to digital media. But rest assured, digital media activates the same reward pathway as drugs and alcohol. And as a matter of fact, there is a guy in France who rigged up this thing to see if rats would find taking selfies reinforcing. First, he paired the selfie with a lever to get sugar water, because rats will press a lever for sugar water. And indeed, every time they pressed the lever for sugar water, they got a selfie. But even when he took the sugar water away, the rats continued to press the lever to see pictures of themselves. Okay, so getting back to our pleasure-pain balance, we've done something pleasurable or reinforcing that releases dopamine in the reward pathway. Our pleasure-pain balance has tilted to the side of pleasure, but no sooner has that happened than our brain adapts to increase dopamine firing by down-regulating dopamine firing, not just to baseline, but actually below baseline into a dopamine deficit state. And you might imagine that as these little gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again. But the gremlins like it on the balance, so they don't get off as soon as we're level. They stay on until we're tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. And that's the hangover, that's the Blue Monday, that's that moment of craving, wanting to have one more cigarette, one more glass of wine, watch one more TikTok video. Now, if we wait long enough, then those gremlins get the message that their job is done, they hop off, and homeostasis is restored. But what happens if we continue to consume our drug of choice over days to weeks to months to years? Those gremlins start to multiply. They get bigger, they get stronger, and eventually they are camped out on the pain side of the balance. And now we've entered addicted brain. We've changed our hedonic set point such that now we need more of our drug in more potent forms, not to feel good and get high, but just to level the balance and feel normal. And importantly, when we're not using, we're walking around with a balance tilted to the side of pain, experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, which are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and craving. In our clinic, we often see patients who are coming in not for addiction, but for anxiety, irritability, insomnia, and other forms of emotional distress. And when we find out that they are in fact using substances and behaviors in an addictive, compulsive way, our intervention is not to give them an antidepressant or even recommend psychotherapy, but instead to recommend that they abstain long enough from their drug of choice to allow those gremlins to hop off of the pain side of the balance so that homeostasis can be restored. And on average, that takes about 3 to 4 weeks. The first 10 to 14 days are extremely difficult because when we first remove that reward off the pleasure side of the balance, all those gremlins that have accumulated on the pain side smash us to the side of pain. But once people get to about week 3 or 4, they start to feel better, they get out of the vortex of craving, and eventually they get to a place where they can begin to have hope about living their lives in a different way. This is an image in the human brain from a very famous study now, showing the brain of healthy control subjects on the left-hand side, and red represents healthy dopamine transmission. So you can see in the reward pathway on the left-hand side, there's plenty of red. On the right-hand side is the brains of individuals who have been using these substances in an addictive way for a long period of time. And you can see that there's very little red. They are in a dopamine deficit state. But what is really important here is the individuals on the right-hand side stopped using their drug of choice 2 weeks before these images were taken. That tells us that it takes a while for those dopamine reward pathways to reset themselves and for those gremlins to hop off the pain side of the balance. And this maps well onto what we call acute withdrawal. So the other thing about that balance is those gremlins, even after they've hopped off the pain side of the balance, will wait in the wings until they have another opportunity to hop back on. And they will hop back on the pain side of the balance if that individual is re-exposed to their drug of choice, or even if they're re-exposed to a reminder of their drug of choice. This is from a series of experiments showing that if you train a rat to know that when it sees a light, if it goes and presses the lever, it will get cocaine, and then you track dopamine levels, what you will see is that, of course, dopamine goes up when the rat gets cocaine, but look at what happens when the rat sees the light. Just knowing that our drug of choice is coming gets us a little bit high. But what if we've been trained to know that a certain trigger will get a reward and then we don't get that reward? What's sometimes called intermittent reinforcement. In this case, although dopamine levels go up a little bit when the rat sees the light, it goes and does the work, presses the lever, doesn't get cocaine, and then dopamine levels go well below baseline. Now the rat is in a dysphoric craving state and will do even more work to get its drug of choice. And if you compare this to social media, for example, and posting something online and getting positive feedback, and then suddenly not getting positive feedback or getting hate, you can imagine the dysphoria and the below-level normals of dopamine that ensue. What I want to do now is widen the lens and consider the world that we live in today and talk about something that I call the plenty paradox. And the plenty paradox has to do with the fact that over the past 20 to 50 years, as nations have gotten richer and richer, their citizens have gotten less and less happy. This is a paradox. You would think that when we have all of our survival needs met, we would be happier than ever, but in fact, the opposite is true. The wealthiest countries in the world now have the highest rates of depression, anxiety, and very sadly, suicide rates are going up fastest in the richest countries of the world. And I would suggest to you a hypothesis that although there are many potential explanations for this plenty paradox, including social dislocation, multi-generational trauma, socioeconomic disparity, I would hypothesize to you that a major driver is our overwhelming overabundance and the way that abundance itself has become a stressor. The way that we now organize our lives around constant rewards, from our first cup of coffee in the morning and our smartphone to the Netflix shows that we binge on in the evening, such that all of us individually and collectively may be struggling with a dopamine deficit state that is contributing to the dissatisfaction, despair, and anxiety that so many people experience in the modern day. Which is why the intervention in order to make a healthy society must take into consideration the stress of overabundance and the harm that we do by constantly rewarding our brains every minute of every day. Such that in order to live in healthy harmony with the way our brains evolved over millions of years of evolution, and by the way, if you think about this pleasure-pain balance, and why on earth would Mother Nature make it so that rewards are fleeting and rewards are followed by pain, it's an absolutely genius mechanism for a world of scarcity and ever-present danger, where we must be the ultimate seekers, never satisfied with what we have, always striving for more in order to survive. But that's no longer the world that we live in now. Now our pleasure-pain balance is actually a liability. So I would suggest to you that in order to leverage the neuroscience to live a healthier, happier life, we must begin first by abstaining from our drug of choice long enough to allow those gremlins to hop off the pain side of the balance and to reset our reward pathways. And this is an image that we've adapted to help with things like technology addiction, where we can't just give up our phones, right? We have to be on them for our jobs, for school, for all the ways that our lives are embedded in this technology. But we might be able to give up pornography for a month, or we might be able to give up social media for a month, or we might be able to give up video games for a month, or alcohol, or cannabis, or in my case, romance novels. As I talk about in my book, I actually got addicted to romance novels. The Twilight Saga was my gateway drug, if any of you are familiar with the Twilight Saga. And I started reading for pleasure, and it was an innocent pastime. But when I got a Kindle, I actually became a chain reader and found myself staying up later and later every night, reading romance novels, going to work bleary-eyed in the morning, eventually getting to a place where I was taking romance novels to work and reading in the 10 minutes between patients. And then found myself 2 years later up at 3 in the morning on a weeknight reading 50 Shades of Grey. And I got to the chapter about butt plugs, and I thought to myself, how did I get here? I'm not even interested in butt plugs. Anyway, the point is, even if you're an addiction doctor and you're a psychiatrist and you know a lot about this process, we can all get into the addiction vortex where we lose sight of what we're doing. And even as I felt myself getting more anxious and depressed, I didn't make the link between my escapist fantasy reading and my mood. And so until I gave it up for a month, which was incredibly difficult, and then felt myself getting better. But because we live in this world of incredible overabundance, we cannot wait until we're in the moment of desire to make the decision not to use. We have to engage in what I call self-binding strategies. This is where we put a barrier between ourselves and our drug of choice so that we can press the pause button between desire and consumption. You'll recognize Odysseus, who had his sailors bind him to the mast so that when they went through, he wouldn't be lured by the sirens, right? So we have to do the same thing. If we decide we want to give up alcohol for a month, we need to get alcohol out of the house. For me, I had to get rid of my Kindle, right? Maybe we want to get a dumb phone if we find we're too attached to our smartphones. So we can use space, time, meaning people are really important. We co-regulate with people. And also medication. So we have more and more medications now that allow us to manage our appetites in the world of overwhelming overabundance, something that's sometimes called recursive adaptation, the way we modulate our own chemistry to adapt to an overabundant dopamine-infused world. Also keep in mind that this pleasure-pain balance works in both directions. So when we press on the pleasure side, those gremlins hop on the pain side. But if we press on the pain side, not too much and not too little, those gremlins will actually go on the pleasure side, and we can get our dopamine indirectly by paying for it up front. And what we see when we engage in exercise is actually that exercise is immediately toxic to cells. But when the body senses injury, it begins to upregulate feel-good neurotransmitters like dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, endogenous cannabinoids, etc. This whole process is called hormesis. Hormesis is a Greek word that means to set in motion. So when we expose ourselves to mild to moderate forms of toxic or painful stimuli, we actually become more robust and healthier. But beware, because anything that gives us access to dopamine has the potential to be addictive. For example, neuroscientists used to think that if you put a running wheel in a rat's cage, it was just a way to measure locomotion. And they actually thought it could only be healthy because it got the rat to press the lever fewer times for cocaine, because instead of using cocaine, it would run on the running wheel. But then the scientists slowly over years discovered that some rats actually got addicted to running wheels. Not many, but there was always a subset that had the potential to get addicted to pain. So something for us to be aware of. In conclusion, I've talked mainly about the ways in which we as individuals can try to combat this world of overwhelming overabundance, but I want to emphasize this is not just an individual problem. Just like climate change, we need top-down solutions, and I really want to emphasize we need to protect kids' developing brains. And this means things like involving families, schools, faith organizations, corporations, government, especially when it comes to addictive social media. I would urge you all to push for getting smartphones out of elementary schools so that kids can have the freedom to learn, teachers can have the freedom to teach, and also to push for age verification so that we can protect kids from some of the dangerous online media that their brains really are not yet developed enough to be able to manage. So in conclusion, here's what I hope you've learned today: that what goes up must come down when it comes to our brain science, that the pursuit of pleasure for its own sake leads to pain, and finally what we can do about it is abstain, maintain with self-binding, and seek out pain. Thank you very much.